That's the two things. There's the mediation, and if scientists themselves are going to fall into this vein of we can't do something that might be harmful to society, well, if it's something truthful, let's put it this way, if it's something that is true, but you are putting it out, you're not going to put it out and have it be published because you're afraid of the potential harm to society, which is what a lot of this is about. It's not about necessarily even that there is going to be harm, it's about the potential harm. At least from what I'm reading this with, like the Nature Human Behavior article, the Ethics and Society Review Boards, even this here is, it's potentially going to offend somebody, or it's potentially going to cause harm, or if it's potentially going to enhance a stereotype, we can't publish it. But then what if that article, a peer-reviewed piece, you can't publish because it might be harmful? It might be harmful. What if it presents something that is true? Okay, I'm back. Something that I wanted to discuss, and it was strangely prompted by I happen to be watching a Timcast IRL clip, where he ended up talking about climate change here briefly, and I'm going to play it in a second to make the point. Many of us in the field, in the STEM fields and science fields, have been concerned about free speech, academic freedom in STEM, in science more broadly, and in universities being ripped apart and destroyed and what have you. And it's wild and crazy. And I don't necessarily disagree. Well, I don't necessarily agree with everything Tim has to say. That's not the point. There's a point that I want to jump off from him and elaborate on a little bit more. In terms of mediation, in terms of how something that is based in a physical science field could end up becoming ideological. And the concerns about that with respect to so-called misinformation and disinformation, which, just to make it clear, misinformation is defined by some as sort of the unknowing lie, whereas disinformation is the malicious, knowingly lying to your audience. So that's the two different kinds of things when you're talking about mis and disinformation, or at least it's my general understanding of that. Could be wrong. And so here's, this is going to run for about 2 minutes. I'm going to let it run for about 2 minutes, but it's prompted off of, and to set the backstory here, what they're talking about is the New Zealand Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, at the UN, calling for basically censorship of anybody with a divergent opinion under the guise of protecting people. And then I want to add to it some other things that are concerning, because there's certainly and I taking this leap off to talk about it more from the perspective of the scientist rather than society and culture as a whole, because I leave that part to others more or less. But the fascinating thing here with this is, yes, as I said, I do think that scientists have, to put it in Jonathan Haidt's words, a quasi-fiduciary duty to help and get to societal education, meaning more so, what is good science, what do we do, all this other kind of stuff. And that runs counter to what Jacinda Ardern and others have proposed. So I'm going to let this run for a couple of minutes, and I may comment over top of it. Again, this is owned by Timcast IRL, so no infringement intended, just to help make a point.
And for its existence is not only legal but noble.
Now, hold on there a minute. I agree with that.
Hang on, that wasn't quite.
And when you tried coming out and saying this, oh, what did she say? What is she?
How do you tackle climate change if people do not believe it exists?
Think about that.
Hold on. I mistimed it here a little bit.
Corporate press that did that.
Yeah. That's the government that did that.
Whoa, yeah, that was former
alliance.
national security. So, what did she say? What is she?
How do you tackle climate change if people do not believe it exists?
Think about that. Here is to get serious, like this is a despotic speech. This is the Prime Minister of New Zealand saying, if people don't believe something exists, you can't manipulate it. It's just remarkable because it's like, imagine going around as a government leader insisting that we should take action to stop the moon men from invading Earth. And you're like, but why doesn't anyone believe me when I tell them the moon men are coming? Maybe you're wrong. Maybe. That's the insane thing about it. That right there is the most important part of the speech. It shows you where these world leaders want us to be. Climate change is ideological. Now, we can talk about the science behind it. That's fine. But there's a rift in politics as to whether or not people think it is or isn't happening. We just had a video the other day where Don Lemon tried pushing a NOAA scientist into saying the hurricane was intensified by climate change, and he would not do it. That's the perfect example of what I'm saying. I think there's climate change issues. I do. But I certainly think when Don Lemon as a zealot is like, how is climate change affecting this? And he goes, it's not. And he goes, well, hold on there a minute. Like I grew up there. I think it is. I think it is. Yeah. Okay. You're a zealot. She's clearly asserting here that she has an ideology that she wants to persist, and there is an opposition to that ideology she does not want to exist. This is the underlying message of what this psychopath is saying. We must address this issue. Yeah. The issue is they want to control what you can think, what you can hear, and what you can see, and ultimately how you'll end up voting because of it.
Yeah.
Okay. So no, I'm not going to comment on the potential motivations or lack thereof or whatever they are of Jacinda Ardern or anybody with that. To Tim's point, you heard him mention the idea that what he said point blank was climate change is ideological. And to that, quasi agree. In that, physically, no, it's not. Because it's a physical process, exacerbated in this time by human beings. Whole other question, a whole other thing right there. But the idea that there's a partisan divide over whether or not people think climate change is happening, not whether or not they believe in climate change, because I get annoyed when people talk about that as a religious belief when that is not what it is. It's process that has been, if you're talking about anthropogenic climate change, which is a long formal name for human-driven climate change, you're talking about something that is not a belief system, but is a physical process that has to do with human interactions. That's a whole other thing, alongside of natural processes that can change climate also. Again, that's not the point here. The idea that there is a partisan divide, which he is actually very correct. You don't need the Don Lemon example to say that. There's plenty of polling that can go from the Yale Climate Communications Group on all the way on down, to Pew, to Gallup, to everybody who's done polling on climate change can tell you what Tim has mentioned. The question, of course, is to that end, why is that the case? And I maintain that we do have our worldviews. That's part of it. But I also point out the notion that quite often the scientific research that any professor, any university, any lab does is not at all what the public tends to see. What the public tends to see is what's written in the press about something. And, of course, the more because particularly in the last few years, the more salacious the headline that can be made from the news article, the more clicks you end up getting, right? But that ends up causing problems with the wild misrepresentations. If you saw a while back, I did the video on Twitter science, the rise of Twitter science, if you will, and one of the things that was talked about early on in that article and early on in that video was about the idea that studies show this and studies show that. Whenever you see news media article discussions of it, and that discussions of a scientific topic, for instance, and often if you go digging deeper into actually reading the article, as I tend to do, or as others tend to do, you find that they can have that a news article can have the study overblown. And I want to give you an example of that. And I'm going to pause real quick on the record so I can get one other thing that I want with that. Okay, a quick pause because I realized I forgot one of the links I needed. The one thing that I want to show to make the point about mediation. This is an article from the National Post in 2017. Economists found compelling evidence that the first letter of your last name matters quite a bit, especially when you're young. So, this is something called alphabetism. And this is one article of many that appeared in 2017 discussing this study on something called alphabetism that was basically argued in the results of their study that that if your last name, first letter of your last name, starts closer to the end of the alphabet, you will have worse outcomes in life. That's what they argued through the entirety of the article. In here. And the authors of the National Post article here go on to talk a little bit more about this. Names can decide our fates. What about the first letter of your last name? Investors are a good example. It may seem illogical to choose an investment bait, but that's quite what's happening. Findings suggest, Professor Zaks and his graduate student colleague, findings suggest teachers pay less attention to students further down in the class roles on average. A version of this study was Colley's undergraduate senior thesis, an idea suggested by Zaks, who was his advisor at the time. Colley stayed on at the University of Colorado as a graduate student, and he expanded the analysis, now being prepared for publication. This article in question that they're discussing here is what's called a preprint. Preprints appear on different servers. SSRN is one server example, and I'm going to show that in a second. But preprints are things that have been sent to publication but have not gone through peer review and have not been published anywhere by any journal yet, meaning they haven't passed the rigorous tests of peer review, or what you would hope would be the rigorous tests of peer review, and they haven't satisfactorily met those tests in review. And as is the case, despite there being a huge number, this is one of many, like I said, despite there being a huge number of these studies many years ago, none of them came back and pointed out that alphabetism paper that had headlines like this was never published. It was never formally published. This is actually the preprint here. It exists on a preprint server, ssrn.com. And so you can go and look this up and access it for free. I read through this preprint and I can understand why it was never published. There's a whole bucket ton of flaws with the methodology and the research there, and no journal is going to publish it with that kind of flaws. And indeed, it was never published. Never published at all. And yet, no retractions from news media articles on these kinds of things. No retractions in that sense. No going back and following up with the authors. Hey, did that thing that you were talking about make it through? That is it good quality stuff? Can we say it's legit according to the scientific community? No. Preprints, if they're salacious enough, or in my view, in this case, silly enough, can just get attention without news media necessarily considering that they're important. Well, not that they're important. News media considering that they haven't been vetted yet. Let's put it that way. Because peer review is essentially the vetting process for any scientific journal, for any journal procedure. That would be the vetting process. Preprints haven't been vetted yet. Often haven't been vetted yet. Now, in some cases, you might find the preprint and you might find the reviews of the preprint. Those things can happen too. But often cases, if it's just a preprint that's on SSRN, perhaps hasn't been vetted yet, hasn't been published. So you got to look and check, where has this article been published? Has it ever been published at all? And that's why I think about the mediation part of it, because news media is one form of mediation. But with the proliferation of social media and Twitter and what have you, the other problem that arises is that, how do I put this? Is that now preprints, studies, things that just came out can get picked up on social media by activist groups, by government agencies, by businesses, by just the average activist person on Twitter really fast and spread around really, really quickly. And so you do have that, along with the really salacious headlines that come out of it. Prime example with climate change in particular. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, representative of AOC, claiming in 2018 we only have 12 years to live. And to the point there, and I talked about this on another video on this channel, so I'm not going to get into it too much here, to the point that the authors of the report to which she was referring, didn't refer to it by name, but it was the only report at the time, had to come out and say, no, that's not what our report says. Our report does not say we will be dead in 12 years. That got completely ignored by most of the media. that the scientists from IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, had to say that. What the report actually said is that you have 12 years to basically reduce the amount of CO2 enough to the point that you won't have really large temperature changes over pre-industrial time by the end of this century. That's actually what they said in the report. That's not what, oh my gosh, that's not what AOC said. Drives everybody crazy. But I give those scientists credit because they came out to the point of saying, you know what? This isn't right. This congresswoman has misrepresented our work. Others have misrepresented our work. Now we got to come out and say something about what was actually said. That was a bunch of scientists who were trying their darndest to uphold their quasi-fiduciary duty to say, no, that's not correct. That's not what we said. And I do think a lot more scientists need to get in there to do that when they see that a newspaper is misrepresenting their research, or when social media is misrepresenting their research, or when some activist hack like perhaps Don Lemon is misrepresenting their research. And yes, Director Jamie Rome was right in what he said to clap back against Don Lemon on CNN. Now, the other bigger concern, though, is the misinformation thing that Jacinda Ardern's after. The problem that I have with this for the scientific research perspective with misinformation is the notion that if you say what is true, or if you say this is true, or like I think a bunch of us saw the law in California recently where basically it was signed into law that doctors cannot contradict established science. Wildly bad. I do hope somebody challenges that in court. And I forget the name of the law exactly, but I do remember that being signed by Gavin Newsom in California recently. When you start saying you can't, this is the truth. When the government starts mandating what's the truth, when international governance starts mandating what the truth is, and trying to reject, silence anything that is contradictory to the consensus, if you will, or to the established science, or to mainstream science, progress towards progress in society grinds to a halt immediately. Why? Because you can't pursue the truth anymore. You can only pursue what is established line. There is no innovation. There is no scientific innovation. There is no growth and change. There is none of that. There is no improvement. There is no advancement. There is no innovation if you are forbidden from pursuing the truth, which is the telos, the ultimate purpose of science. My concern is when the notion of such things around misinformation and disinformation, or basically saying this, you can't contradict mainstream X, which again, you won't have progress if you're not allowed to do contradictions of these things. You will only have it in one direction. You'll have very narrow representation of what the truth actually, very narrow procedure going on here. And that doesn't help with any amount of progress. My concern is even more so when it starts coming from the scientists themselves. And I have 3 recent examples in tabs that I've talked about in other videos, like this one. This comes from the Journal of Physical Chemistry letters. A bunch of chemists, mind you. And I already talked about this on a Rogue Journal Club episode with Gina, so I'm not going to get too much into it. It's episode 4. It's back a few weeks on this channel's history, so you can find it. It's a long episode because we had a lot to say about it. But these guys argue on the debate over free speech, inclusivity, and academic excellence. So they argue such cases as Thomas Hoodlicki having his paper removed, utterly deleted. It was not retracted. It was forcibly withdrawn and deleted, because even with retractions, you leave it up with a reason why the journal thinks it's crap. You don't just utterly delete it off the internet. They called this a whole thing of, no, the incident's better framed as a manifestation of consequences culture, because it's natural for community to maintain and enforce its social norms. To defend Hoodlicki's essay on the grounds that there should be no limits on free speech without considering the implications of that speech is to pretend that words have no consequences. False binary for one thing on there, because as talked about with actually straw manning, really, but the idea being that folks are saying all the defenders of free speech are saying that words have no consequences. No, that's not what we're saying. Fact of the matter is, quite obviously, we're saying the opposite, that words have lots of consequences because they help move progress forward in society, let alone just in science itself. But goodness gracious. These authors in this one of them includes a program director for the National Science Foundation, by the way. This is one where they argue that basically silencing speech is moving towards a recalibration of norms, was another phrase that they used in here. Recalibrating norms, without asking whether that recalibration is a good thing or needed. Never ask that question, do they? But you see something like that too. But that's coming from scientists themselves who ought to know better. This one, did a review of this one before my vacation in September. Ethics and Society Review Boards. Basically, putting your research paper that you want to get published before a committee to see whether or not your research is harmful to society. Harmful to society. That is literally kind of what's said in here. And this is open access, so like I said, I encourage you to go read these things. What is harmful to society changes on a whim, perhaps. And who defines what is harmful to society? The Nature of Human Behavior article, this one, was another one in recent history. This is new ethics guidelines for publications in Nature of Human Behavior in the Springer Nature journals. Nature, one of the most prestigious, I don't think of it too highly too much anymore, but prestigious journals here. Let me see. Although academic freedom is fundamental, it is not unbounded. The same ethical consideration should underlie science as about humans as applied to research with human participants. Well-established ethics frameworks govern the conduct of studies with human participants. And that's true, and that is a good thing. Research ethics bodies use these frameworks to examine prospectively whether research projects involving human participants align with ethical principles. However, these frameworks apply to research involving the participation of humans and do not generally consider the potential benefits and harms of research about humans who do not participate directly in the research. Such research is typically exempt from ethics review. Yet people can be harmed indirectly. For example, research may inadvertently stigmatize individuals or human groups. It may be discriminatory, racist, sexist, ableist, or homophobic. It may provide justification for undermining the human rights of specific groups simply because of their characteristics. This was guidance for the editors of Nature journals, and they claim it's not binding. We'll see. To basically say you need to look at how this thing will have a negative impact on groups of people, harm groups of people, harm those marginalized in society, if you will. At the time, one of the things I said about this article when I reviewed it is your article can get out into society, and God only knows what'll happen. What some people do with it now. There's the known knowns. You know certain people who will read it. You know how certain people react to it. You have the known unknowns, which is to say, I know other people may read it in the public. I have no idea how they will react. And then you have the unknown unknowns. You don't know a whole bunch of people who may read it. There's probably a whole bunch of people you have no idea that will read it. And you have no idea at all how they're going to react to. Same kinds of things can happen with these articles. And even to the best possible thing here, you can have absolutely no control over how the article is represented. And yet, these are 3 highly respected articles in sciences, all of which tend to lead toward the same idea, that if it's potentially going to harm society, potentially going to harm a group of people, because Hoodlicky was Hoodlicky in this article that they talked about was writing about the problems and the things he'd seen teaching and changing and teaching chemistry, and how he was upset with some of the younger generation and what have you, and his article was thusly retracted because some of the things he said, it was admittedly fiery language when I got to read of it before it disappeared, and I might not have said it, but it was his opinion. I didn't have a problem with that. I didn't have a problem with it being his opinion, mind you. I wouldn't have said some of the things that were in there myself, to be clear. But the question here is, going back to the point with misinformation, disinformation. Supposedly the idea with getting rid of misinformation and disinformation is it's harmful to society. Who defines harmful? How do you define harmful to society? Is it because it just potentially is offensive to somebody? This is the concern that I have. If scientists are forced to constrain themselves because something may be harmful to society, then you don't have the pursuit of the truth anymore. You'd be too afraid to do it because you'd end up losing your career. You wouldn't be able to get it published anyway. And then, as I said, scientific research goes out the window. More so, this wasn't a particular analysis, but it's pointing to some thoughts and some concerns. I am not trying to suggest there's some giant cabal of people who are collaborating, coordinating together, anything like that. I'm not trying to go down the conspiracy theory route. I'm merely making the point that, for one thing, to wrap this up, for one thing, there's a lot of mediators between scientific papers, admittedly like this one even, and the public, be it now social media, advocacy groups, news media, what have you. And quite often you are not seeing the full picture with different scientific papers that are published because of that. And I think there would be very few that would disagree with me on that one. The other thing to make a point of is when you start then constricting what scientists are allowed to study based on the potential harm to society, whatever that is, then it stops being about the pursuit of the truth. Does this mean we do anything unethical with respect to human subjects and research? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. But it does mean that you weigh it very carefully with the idea of, I'm pursuing the truth, but then what is my responsibility after the paper is published? After my research becomes available? And I do think then it becomes the responsibility of the scientist, at this point particularly, to do their darndest to make sure their research is represented correctly in media, that it doesn't get misrepresented. Very difficult to do. And I would hope that there's some news outlets that arise that help represent the articles correctly. But I don't know. With that one, I don't necessarily have hope that that would be the case. So that's my kind of two main things here. This was a little bit off the cuff and a little bit different because I didn't have a particular article to talk about. I was wanting to go off of Tim's comments, and thank you. Thank you guys, Tim, folks over there at Timcast IRL. It was an excellent video, and gave me some extra things to think about as I think about it in the context of what's going on in the scientific world. But this article in particular got me so annoyed. But anyway, that's a whole other tangent. That's the two things. There's the mediation, and if scientists themselves are going to fall into this vein of, we can't do something that might be harmful to society. Well, if it's something truthful, let's put it this way, if it's something that is true, but you are putting it out, you're not going to put it out and have it be published because you're afraid of the potential harm to society, which is what a lot of this is about. It's not about necessarily even that there is going to be harm, it's about the potential harm. At least from what I'm reading this with, like, the Nature Human Behavior article, the Ethics and Society Review Boards, even this here is, it's potentially going to offend somebody, or it's potentially going to cause harm, or if it's potentially going to enhance a stereotype, we can't publish it. But then what if that article, a peer-reviewed piece, you can't publish because it might be harmful? It might be harmful. What if it presents something that is true? It is true about something going on in society, about something going on in the physical world, in something going on, remember, the interaction with society and the natural world. If that's true, but you can't put it out there because it's harmful to society, or not harmful, because it's potentially harmful to society, have you not done more harm to society by not sharing them something true? That's the point I went. Let me reiterate it. If the article in question is not put out because of the potential harm it could do to society, as defined by the ideas of potentially going to have stereotype, potentially going to have a negative impact on one group over another, potentially going to be misused, potentially going to offend, all those things being potential. If it potentially going to cause harm is the reason you can't put the article out, but the article then does contain something true, have you not done more harm to society by not sharing something that is true? That is the question. That is the question as I close out today. Let me know what you think on this whole bunch of ideas. If you like this video, hit the like button on the way out the door, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that lovely good jazz. And until next time, I'm Adrian. Stay curious, folks.